Hi Silem stars, you're welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, then you're welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you guys how to make a drop shoulder yoke. Okay, so how to draft it and how to sew it from start to finish. In my last video, I got a lot of requests to make this tutorial, and of course I answered. But anyway, without further ado, let's get right into the video. So we're going to start with our front piece. The first thing I did was to draw a baseline at the top, and from that baseline I'm marking the armhole line 8 inches, bust point 10 inches, under bust 13 inches, and waistline 16 inches. Now I'm just extending all those lines, so just go ahead and mark all your vertical measurements. Now I'm labeling the lines. CL is chest line, BP bust point, UB under bust, WL waistline. Now I divided the shoulder measurements by 2 and I marked that on the baseline. Now for my neck width, I'm using 3.5 inches. For the neck depth, I'm also using 3.5 inches. Now I'm just connecting those 2 points with a curve to create the neckline. Now from that shoulder, I'm going to come down by 1 inch, and then I'm going to connect that point to the neck width to create the shoulder slope. Now on the chest line, I'm going to mark the same shoulder divided by 2 measurements that I had marked on the baseline, marking that same point on the chest line and connecting that to the shoulder slope. Now I'm going to measure that line I have, and then I'm going to mark the midpoint. At that midpoint, I'm going to come in by 1/2 inch in order to take out any folding. Now I'm going to use my curved ruler to connect the shoulder slope, that 1/2 inch mark, and the chest line. Okay, now on the chest line I'm marking my bust circumference divided by 4, and then the next thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to mark my dart. I just simply took my nipple to nipple measurement divided by 2. I marked that, and then I came down from the bust points by 1 inch, and then I'm just drawing a straight line to connect those points. Now for the width of my dart is actually just 1/2 inch on both sides of that dart line. Okay, so I'm just taking 1/2 inch on both sides of the dart line to create the dart. Now it's time for me to take the rest of my horizontal measurements. So I've already marked my bust divided by 4 on the chest line. I'm just adding 1.5 inches seam allowance. On the waistline, I divided the waist measurement by 4, and then I'm marking that dart. So I'm replacing the dart that I had added, and I'm adding my normal 1.5 inches seam allowance, and then I'm just connecting those points together. Now it's time for us to create the drop shoulder yoke, which is the main part of this tutorial. So the first thing you want to do is you want to extend your shoulder slope. Okay, now from that point you want to mark 3.5 inches. Okay, so from where your shoulder stop, mark 3.5 inches. Now from that point downwards, mark 1.5. okay, now use a curve to connect that 1.5 inch mark to where your shoulder had stopped initially. Can you see? And then the next thing you want to do now is to create a curve and connect it to the midpoint of your armhole curve. Okay, now you can decide to make this curve however you want. You can make it to curve upwards or make it curve downwards. All right, just make sure you blend it into that line. So as you can see now, what I'm doing is I'm blending the sleeve into the curve of the armhole, and I'm cutting that out. Okay, so just do exactly what I'm doing, and that is it for our front piece. So easy. Moving on to the back, the first thing we're going to do now is we're going to mark our zipper allowance. I'm using 1.5 inches for the zipper allowance, and I'm just connecting the points together. And then I'm also marking my baseline at the top of the paper. From the baseline downwards, I'm marking the same vertical measurements: chest line 8 inches, bust point 10 inches, under bust 13 inches, and waistline 16 inches. So just mark your vertical measurements and be sure to label the lines so you don't get confused. Now from that zip allowance line, that's where I'm going to be taking all my measurements. I'm going to divide the shoulder by 2. I'm marking that on the baseline. For the width of the neck, I use 3.5, and for the depth, I'm using 2 inches. Now I'm just connecting them like so. I'm going to also mark the same shoulder divided by 2 on the chest line, and then I'm going to come down from the baseline by 1 inch. Just the same thing we did for the front. Then I'm connecting that to the neck width to create the shoulder slope. I'm also going to connect that shoulder slope down to the chest line. And then like we did for the front, I'm just going to measure the line and then get the midpoint and mark that. Now I'm going to connect that with a curve to the chest line. For the front piece, we went in by ½ inch at that midpoint, but for the back, we are not going to be doing that. Now for my back dart, I'm going up from the bust point by 1 inch, but I'm still marking my nipple to nipple measurement divided by 2 for the darts, okay? And then at the bottom part there, at the waistline, I'm going to go out on both sides of the dart line by ½ inch and connect that all the way up to the top of the dart line, and that will create the dart as you can see. Now we're going to mark the rest of our horizontal measurements. I'm going to mark the bust divided by 4 on the chest line and add 1.5 inches seam allowance. On the waistline, I'm going to divide the waist measurement by 4, replace the dart that I have there. The dart I have there is 1 inch. I'm going to replace that and then add the normal 1.5 inches seam allowance, and then I'm going to connect them together. Now it's time for us to draft the drop shoulder for the back. So like I said, extend the shoulder slope. Now mark the sleeve length. This is actually the sleeve length, this 3.5 you see here. Okay, so if you want your sleeves to be longer than 3.5, make sure you mark the sleeve length you want. Now at that point, come down by 1.5 and create a curve to the initial shoulder you had. Now you can decide to make your curve facing upwards or facing downwards, but just make sure you connect it to that midpoint, okay? And then also blend it into the rest of the armhole curve. And this is basically it. Now the final thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go in at the waistline where I have that zipper allowance. I'm going to go in by ½ inch and connect that all the way up, just to take out any form of zipper bulging, okay? So all we're going to do now is we're going to cut this out, and then we're going to transfer this to our fabric, and then we'll sew it together. Now you can go ahead and transfer the pattern directly to your fabric if you don't want to use the yoke, okay? You don't want to separate the yoke, but for me, I want to separate the yoke, and I don't want my yoke to be as low as my chest line. So I'm just marking where I want my yoke to stop. I want mine to stop at 7 inches, but I'm just drawing a curve, okay, and connecting that to the armhole. I'm going to do the same thing for the back. From the shoulder there, I'm just marking how long I want my yoke to be, which is 7 inches, and then I'm using my curved ruler to just connect that back to the armhole, okay? So just go ahead and cut out your yoke. Now as you can see, I've transferred it to my fabric and I left the allowance up at the top and at the bottom. As you can see, for the yoke, you can see where I left my allowance. I left my allowance along the shoulder, along the armhole, and at the bottom, okay? So now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to transfer my darts from the pattern to my fabric. So I'm just transferring my darts now. Now this is what my darts look like. I'm just going to go ahead now and put in my darts. But then before I put in my darts, I'm just going to place the yoke. Then I'm going to pin them. I made sure to align them at the center or the midpoint, and then I pinned it from the midpoint to one end and from the midpoint to the other end. So if you don't know where the midpoint is on your yoke and on your piece, just go ahead and mark the midpoint first before you pin them. For the back, as you can see, I also left the allowance the same way I did for the front. I left the allowance at the top and at the bottom for the main piece, and for the yoke I left the allowance along the shoulder, along the armhole, and at the bottom as well. That's for the yoke. Now same process, we're going to transfer our darts for the back. So we'll just go ahead now and put in the darts. We're going to attach the yokes, okay? Place them right sides facing like so. And then we're going to sew from one end to the other end and from one end to the other end. So after joining the yoke, this is what we have. I also went ahead to top stitch after joining the yoke, okay? So I top stitch right on the lace, that's right on the yoke. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and pipe the armhole and the neckline. For me, I'm using a piece of the main fabric. I just cut a 1 inch wide fabric that I'm going to be using to pipe my piece, okay? You can also use a bias tape if you prefer. Now the way I'm going to pipe my piece, I'm going to be piping it from the wrong side and flipping it to the right side and then sewing it. The reason why I'm doing it like that is so that the design of the fabric shows on the right side, as you can see, okay? So if you don't want yours to be like this, you can just do it the other way, which is from the right side to the wrong side. Now I'm placing the back pieces together and then I'm joining them along the zipper allowance, as you can see, okay? Now I'm going to open up the zipper allowance and then iron it flat, okay? After that, I'm going to place the front piece on top of the back piece, join them along the shoulders with 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then I'm also joining them along the sides as well with the actual body measurements. And this is what it looks like. This is a finished look, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe.